Alright, so when I was about 16 and you heard about motor swaps, you always thought that you could basically drop a motor in, start the thing up, and go, but that is not the case. So to do this swap, obviously you do need a motor, and those could be had for not a lot of money. But the rest of the swap is where the time, money, and effort start to add up.
Alright, so now to go over the cost of actually completing this swap. Now, like we said, there are a bunch of ways that you could, in theory, K-swap your Miata. The easiest way to do this is to buy a swap kit, which is what we did. And again, we got our swap kit from KPower Industries, and everything worked actually really well from the kit. We were pretty happy with it. So the first item on our build list here is that swap kit. Now, KPower offers a bunch of different levels of kit, depending on what way you want to go and how much DIY stuff you want to do. So Matt could go through and just go over what kit we got and why we got it.
So we went with the Ultimate Kit, what they call the Ultimate Kit, and that includes most of the components that you'll need to do a K-swap. I don't have a lot of fabrication experience or tools to do it, and I was on a little bit of a crunch timeline, so I thought it would be best to spend a little bit more money but save a ton of time and effort in doing the swap.
So the price of that swap kit was about $4,300.
So starting with the engine section of the components you'll need, obviously you need an engine. You can get that usually from a junkyard. You also need an ECU, an engine control unit. It's just a computer that tells the engine when to perform certain actions like fire the spark plugs or control the injectors. You also need the oil pump adapter kit in order to make this oil pump work with the swap. They don't include that with the kit, I believe, because there are some people who are able to work around that if they have a different subframe or a different application. But you do need that if you're going to configure it like this. The modified valve cover is another cost if you're going to try to keep your hood not with a hole in it. But again, you can send in your valve cover that you give the engine, and then they'll send you one that's already been modified. Like we mentioned earlier, the engine harness is another cost for this swap. It saves a lot of time, so if you're not very experienced with building wiring harnesses, I definitely recommend it. The alternator and starter for this engine, if your engine doesn't come with it, you'll also need those, but they can be found pretty easily at the junkyard. You'll need then a bunch of sensors. I went through and replaced a bunch of these. Even though they were already on the engine, I felt it safer to replace them while it was out. You also need some seals for the engine if you want to do some preventative maintenance. I replaced the valve cover gasket, the spark plug tube seals, the valve cover bolt grommets on top of the valve cover. I replaced the timing chain itself. Even though those don't really break very often, I definitely do not want to have to get back in there and do it. And if it fails, it can potentially destroy the engine.
So with all that, that's going to get you your engine, your wiring harness, and included with the swap kit before, you basically have everything that you need to actually get that engine in there, replace all your sensors and your timing chain, so all your maintenance will be done, so you actually have a very reliable Honda engine, because that's why a lot of people are going to be doing this swap, and then you'll be pretty much good to go. So total cost of everything there that we just talked about is around $3,700, $3,800. So if you include that with the swap kit that we talked about earlier, we're already a little bit over $8,000 for this swap.
Alright, so for the cooling system on the car, first of all, if you don't already have a bigger than stock radiator, I would definitely recommend it, especially if you're going to be using this in any type of like track or autocross application. I was lucky enough to already have one with this car, so I didn't need to include that. Other than that, for the cooling system, you need to replace the thermostat assembly on the car. It's not like a normal thermostat that you'd see for most cars. It's a whole housing and thermostat included in one piece. To actually read the coolant temperature, there are two sensors that can go into the back of that upper coolant neck that we mentioned earlier. One is the Honda engine coolant temperature sensor, and that will send a signal to the ECU so it knows what temperature it's at. The other one is actually the stock Miata engine coolant temperature sensor, and that will just drive the dashboard gauge, so you can still use your temperature gauge in the car. Along with that, there's a few coolant hoses that I bought, and they're actually pretty close to off the shelf. I had to cut a couple of them, but we can provide a list of which exact numbers those are so that you can pick them up off of the internet or your local parts store.
Yeah, everything we're talking about here is going to be linked in a spreadsheet down below to make your K-swaps as easy as possible. So that's going to wrap up the cooling section there. So additional things for cooling that does not include the aluminum radiator that once again we would recommend doing. That's going to be about an extra $300 or so on the swap.
So for the exhaust section of the swap, it was actually very simple for us. The kit came with this downpipe and crossover pipe, and then you could potentially build your own or any custom 3-inch exhaust back from that. But again, not much fabrication skills here. So I just went with KMiata's off-the-shelf option, which is a 3-inch all the way back exhaust, including a muffler and a resonator. And that was it for us.
Yeah. So that exhaust looks very, very nice. If you get the KMiata one, it's sweet. Fitment was like pretty much perfect, which saved us tons of fabrication time. And overall, it was pretty nice.
All right, so for your intake, obviously you have the intake manifold if you went with the KMiata kit. But forward of that, I just have a kind of strange routing right now. I definitely want to keep playing with that. But what it includes is a couple of silicone elbows, an aluminum elbow, and a big filter up at the top. Alright, so there's some other things you'll need for the drivetrain part of your swap. If you don't already have a clutch that can handle around 160 foot-pounds of torque, then you'll need to upgrade to one that can. I was already running a Happy Meal from Flying Miata, so the Stage 1 clutch, so I just used that. The only other thing I had to get for the drivetrain was just some transmission fluid. I used some Redline GL4 stuff. You can go with the Ford Motorcraft stuff or anything else that you want to use that's actually right for this for your particular transmission.
So for all this additional drivetrain stuff, you should be in it for about $300 or so. One thing that I would make a note of is if you have an open diff in one of these cars, you definitely should put a limited slip diff in there. I still have an open diff in my Turbo Miata, and it lights up one tire. This thing, as you saw from our 0 to 60 video, if you have not watched that, go check it out. But this will light up 2 tires, no problem, with a limited slip diff. So you're going to want to get one of those in your car.
So for the fuel system on this car, there's a few things you need to do. One big thing to note is that, especially if you have an NA, it uses a return type fuel system. That means that fuel comes from the tank through the pump, goes to the fuel rail on the engine, and then extra fuel is sent back to the tank. However, this engine is a returnless style, so that means that fuel only comes from the tank, goes to the fuel rail, and there's no way for it to go back. So to adapt these two styles together, what I had to get was a fuel pressure regulator. So it's hooked up such that fuel comes into it, the correct fuel pressure is sent to the fuel rail, and then any extra fuel is sent back to the tank with the stock hard lines. So then there are just a few more things that didn't really fit into any other sections, but are still very important for the swap. One is just some nice butt splices for connecting the alternator and starter wires together. A couple other things that I would definitely recommend are some heat wrap for the brake lines, because those also tend to run right near where the exhaust is routed in this swap, and you do not want to boil your brake fluid, obviously, so just putting some insulation on those would be highly recommended.
Yeah, so that's most of the miscellaneous costs and additional expenses that went along with this thing. I would estimate somewhere around $250 to $500 in extra stuff that you're just gonna need to throw money at to get everything wrapped up nicely. It could really vary a lot depending on how you decide to go ahead and do your swap though. So that wraps up pretty much everything for costs and necessary components that went into getting this thing done. And the cost will vary a little bit. Once again, we have our cost for this build up on the screen right now, but I would estimate somewhere between $10,000 and $12,000 to K-swap your Miata. Now that is using the Z3, which does not use a custom subframe. If you want to use a different engine that has the 4:1 header on there and some other just slightly different components, you're going to be looking at a slightly more expensive swap. Another thing to consider is when you're doing the swap, you are taking some parts off that you could sell and recuperate some money. So those parts that you're taking off to sell include the engine, your original engine mounts, your flywheel. If you already had an upgraded flywheel like Matt did, he already had the Flying Miata one in there, you could make some pretty good money back with that. You could also sell your ECU, which actually is a surprising chunk of change there. And what else is there for components? That's most of what you could sell straight out of the Miata.
I think you covered it, yeah. There's not much else that you really take off that's a big deal for this, but that's kind of the beauty of the swap, is that you retain so much of what makes a Miata a Miata.
Yep. Yeah, that's why this swap is so awesome. You don't really add weight to the car, you're basically doubling your power, and it drives similar to a Miata, just a much faster Miata. Let's see, what else could we talk about with this thing in terms of costs and things to expect? I guess timeline-wise, if you're going to do this swap and you're going to get this kit, even though it's a bolt-in kit and it does make everything super fast, it's not like you're going to get all of this stuff done in an afternoon. Hard to estimate the exact amount of time that we spent on it, but I think I probably spent like 4 days working at your house, probably between 4 and 8 hour days, and you did a lot more than me while I wasn't there.
Yeah, it was a lot of just like after work, heading over to the garage and messing around with stuff for an hour or two here or there. If I were to do this again, knowing what I know now and already having all the parts, I think I could get it done in 3 or 4 weekends of like really hard working on it, from stock Miata to where it sits now.
Yeah. Oh, another cost that I don't think we talked about on our spreadsheet, since I'm thinking about it, you're going to want to get this thing dyno tuned.
Yeah.
Because when you put the swap in and you run it on the Honda ECU, it's not really tuned specifically for your engine, your intake, and your exhaust setup. So you should also budget probably $500 to $1,000 for a really good dyno tune, so you know your car is safe, reliable, and actually making the most out of that engine that you just put so much time and money into getting in there. And with all that, that's pretty much going to wrap up this video. If you want to see how to actually K-swap your Miata and watch us K-swap this one, I have the whole entire build series laid out on my channel, so you could go step by step and see what goes into actually swapping this thing. Our light's dying over here, so we're getting some nice strobe effect on our engine. But with all that, if you want to see this car more, subscribe to the channel. If you want to see turbo cars and other projects, subscribe to the channel. Like this video if you enjoyed it, and I hope you stick around for the next one. Take care.